On the evening of April 21st, 2026, the Harvard Business School Association of Northern California honored Brad Garlinghouse as its 2026 Business Leader of the Year at a sold-out dinner at San Francisco's historic Julia Morgan Ballroom, drawing more than 250 business leaders and HBS alumni. The highlight was a 40-minute fireside chat between Garlinghouse and Ripple's co-founder and executive chairman, Chris Larsen, the founder who first brought Garlinghouse on as CEO nearly a decade ago. Past honorees of the award, which has run since 1969, include Andy Jassy, Sal Khan, John Chambers, Gordon Moore, Andy Grove, George Shultz, William Hewlett, and David Packard. Let that list sit for a moment. These are the architects of modern American industry, and Garlinghouse is now in that group. Harvard Business School professor David B. Yothy praised Garlinghouse for his focus on scalability, noting his extraordinary ability to scale a complex platform while maintaining a steadfast commitment to his core vision. Now, here's why this matters structurally, not just symbolically. Institutional capital does not deploy into companies whose leadership hasn't cleared a credibility threshold. Harvard Business School is one of the institutions that sets that threshold for the global financial community. When a portfolio manager at a pension fund, a sovereign wealth vehicle, or a major endowment needs to justify an XRP allocation to their investment committee, a Harvard Business Leader of the Year recognition is exactly the kind of credential that changes the conversation from "Is this legitimate?" to "How do we size the position?" That is not speculation. That is how institutional allocation cycles actually work. Garlinghouse has also been publicly advocating for the Clarity Act, arguing that the regulatory window is wide open and calling for swift action from lawmakers. A CEO who just received the Harvard recognition and is simultaneously advocating for federal legislation is not operating as a startup founder. He is operating as a financial infrastructure executive with institutional relationships to match. But the Harvard recognition is only half of this week's story. What dropped 4 days later is the development that actually changes Ripple's regulatory timeline. And most people are reading it as a general fintech bill when it's actually something much more specific. That's next. On April 23rd, 2026, Representatives Young Kim and Sam Liccardo introduced the Payments Access and Consumer Efficiency Act, the PACE Act, in the House of Representatives. The bill seeks to allow qualified non-bank financial companies, including certain fintech and digital asset businesses, to directly access Federal Reserve payment infrastructure, including the FedWire Fund Service, FedNow Service, and FedACH services. Now let's understand why this is specifically about Ripple. Ripple already has a Fed Master Account application pending, filed in 2025 through its standard custody subsidiary. That application falls into what the Fed calls Tier 3, the slowest review track, where only 2 uninsured institutions have ever been granted full access. Under the current framework, that application has no deadline. The Fed can review it for years. There is no statutory obligation to decide. The PACE Act would replace that open-ended queue with a statutory deadline. The OCC has 180 days to deem an application complete and another 180 days to approve or deny it. If the OCC misses that second window, the application is automatically granted. A process that currently runs with no deadline turns into a clock that caps out at roughly a year, with the regulator on the defensive rather than the applicant. And crucially, the PACE Act creates a new statutory category, Registered Covered Provider. That firms must be classified as depository institutions to access FedWire and ACH directly. Ripple could plug into the rails without converting into a full bank. The framework comes to Ripple instead of the other way around. Ripple and Circle are specifically named as 2 of the biggest beneficiaries because both already hold conditional OCC national trust charters, putting them among the few crypto firms with the federal infrastructure to plug into this framework on day one. To qualify, firms need money transmitter licenses in at least 40 states. Ripple already holds licenses across most of the United States. This is not a bill that Ripple needs to spend years preparing for. It is a bill that Ripple qualifies for today. And that collapses the FedRail access timeline from indefinite to 360 days by statute. Now, before you read that as a guaranteed catalyst, there's a catch that the optimistic read leaves out. You may be misreading the actual risk-adjusted timeline. That's next. The PACE Act was introduced in the House on April 23rd. A Senate companion bill has not yet been introduced. A spokesperson said a Senate version is under discussion. That matters. A House bill without a Senate companion is a proposal, not a law in motion. The Clarity Act cleared the House 294-134 last July. It still hasn't passed the Senate. It's been over 9 months. So the honest read is this. The PACE Act is a structurally significant bill that names Ripple specifically as a day one beneficiary. It has bipartisan support, introduced by a Republican and a Democrat from California, the state where Ripple is headquartered. But its passage timeline is not the Clarity Act timeline. It is a separate legislative track. And right now, the Clarity Act Senate markup is still the highest priority regulatory catalyst for XRP price before any PACE Act dynamics materialize. What the PACE Act does in the near term is different. It signals congressional intent to eliminate the banking lobby's structural advantage in blocking non-bank fintech access to Fed rails. The Blockchain Association CEO, Summer Mersinger, welcomed direct access for digital asset payment companies to the same financial infrastructure as other providers, stating it would enable faster and cheaper payment services. Congressional intent, backed by a bipartisan House bill, and Ripple named as a primary beneficiary, that is a credibility signal, not a price trigger. The price trigger is the Clarity Act markup, the FOMC meeting on April 28-29th, and Warsh's confirmation vote on April 30th. 3 events in the next 4 days. PACE is the infrastructure layer underneath all of them. And that brings us to the part most channels won't connect, because it requires building from the regulatory layer down into the actual technology that makes XRP's utility proposition fundamentally different from every other payment token, the Interledger Protocol, and why it explains the long-term price ceiling. That's exactly where we're going. To understand why XRP's utility case is different from speculation, you need to understand what the Interledger Protocol actually does, and why it is the reason Ripple can describe itself as building the Internet of Value, rather than just another payment network. Stephen Thomas and Evan Schwartz published the ILP white paper in October 2015 while working at Ripple Labs. The document described a communication protocol to enable interoperable payments by acting as a universal translator among different financial networks. The Interledger Protocol was modeled after TCP/IP, the foundational technology behind the Internet's ability to transmit data across diverse networks. Here's the key distinction. The Internet solved the problem of connecting different data networks. The Interledger Protocol is designed to solve the same problem for money networks. In July 2017, the Bank of England carried out a successful test of the Interledger Protocol, a test transaction that synchronized payments between the central bank's core real-time gross settlement system with a similar core system used by another central bank. The test demonstrated that the Interledger Protocol could reduce the time it takes to settle a large cross-border payment from 4 days to a few seconds. And now the use case that nobody is talking about at scale yet, but that represents potentially the largest addressable market in XRP's entire ecosystem: micropayments. One case that the Interledger Protocol already serves much better than legacy payment systems is micropayments, payments that are too small to be worth thinking about individually. To date, businesses have had to work around the need for micropayments by using subscription models or advertisement revenue. ILP can stream tiny payments as an alternative. where systems can charge per-use fees without needing to ask and prompt a person to decide about every individual purchase. Think about what that actually means for XRP. Right now, a Wall Street Journal article costs 10 cents to read. It costs more than $1 to collect that 10 cents payment through legacy payment infrastructure. The business model is broken, so they force you into a subscription. If micropayments work at scale, using XRP as the settlement bridge, that constraint disappears. Pay 10 cents per article. Pay 3 cents per song. Pay per second of a video stream instead of per month of a subscription. When Brad Garlinghouse says the Internet of Value will let people get paid by the minute instead of by the month, that is not a metaphor. That is the ILP architecture. And the scale of that addressable market, when you account for every content platform, every media company, every creator economy participant globally, dwarfs the cross-border payments market that XRP is already targeting. If you're finding this breakdown useful, the kind of analysis that connects legislation, technology, and institutional positioning into one coherent picture, subscribe. This is what we build every week. Data, not hype. The button is right there. Let's close the loop on price with precision, not ambition. Wisdom Tree's ETF filing documented that XRP needs only a 20x move to displace Bitcoin from the #1 market cap position. That means roughly $55 to $60 per XRP based on current Bitcoin market capitalization. That is a ceiling defined by math, not narrative. More conservatively and more near-term, analyst consensus for XRP reaching Ethereum's current market cap range places the price between $7 and $10. That is the realistic institutional cycle target if the Clarity Act passes, the PACE Act progresses, and Ripple achieves direct Fed rail access within 12 to 18 months. XRP is trading around $1.42. Exchange reserves are at a 7-year low of 1.7 billion XRP. Bollinger Bands are tightening. The 50-day EMA crossed above the 200-day, a golden cross confirmation. Resistance sits at $1.55. A clean close above $1.55 on volume above 3 billion daily dollars opens the path to $1.90, Ali Martinez's symmetrical triangle target. But here's the honest framework for the long-term thesis. Price is a function of 3 variables that must converge. 1. Regulatory clarity. Clarity Act passage makes XRP's commodity classification permanent in federal statute. That is the institutional compliance gateway. 2. Infrastructure access. PACE Act passage gives Ripple direct FedWire, FedNow, and FedACH access without needing to convert into a full depository bank. That is the payment rail gateway. 3. Utility adoption at scale. ILP-enabled micropayments, tokenized asset settlement on XRPL, and cross-border liquidity through ODL. Right now, Variable 1 is pending. Variable 2 was just introduced. Variable 3 has $3.5 billion in live tokenized assets on XRPL and is operating in over 130 countries. The infrastructure is real. The demand is building. A regulatory layer is in motion. That combination, not a single catalyst, but a convergence, is what changes the price ceiling. Here's the picture this week painted when you connect the events. On April 21st, Harvard Business School placed Brad Garlinghouse in the same lineage as the founders of Intel, HP, Cisco, and Amazon, in front of 250 institutional investors. On April 23rd, Congress introduced a bill that names Ripple specifically as a Day 1 beneficiary of direct Federal Reserve rail access and places a statutory 360-day countdown on a process that currently has no deadline. On April 28th and 29th, the FOMC meets under Powell's final session, with the incoming Fed chair holding over $100 million in crypto. On April 30th, the Senate Banking Committee votes on Warsh. And underneath all of it, the Clarity Act markup with a May 21st hard deadline, the PACE Act progressing in the House, Ripple's Fed Master Account application pending in Tier 3, and XRP exchange reserves at 7-year low. This is not a story about price prediction. This is a story about regulatory architecture converging with institutional credibility and technological infrastructure in the same 4-week window. The variables are real, the timeline is specific, and the confluence has not been this tight at any point in 2026. What to watch this week? The FOMC forward guidance language on April 29th. The Warsh Committee vote on April 30th. Whether the Clarity Act markup gets a date before May 21st. Those 3 data points will tell you more about XRP's next structural move than any price model currently on the market. This is XRP News Flow Signals. Data, not hype.